The first whispers of the strange sightings reached Emma Carter late one evening, as she sat in the dim glow of her laptop, scrolling through the local news forum. A handful of posts, scattered over the past week, all described the same thing: a gaunt, hollow-eyed man in tattered clothes, seen shuffling through the foggy streets just before dawn. What caught her attention wasn't just the eerie descriptions, it was the name repeated in hushed tones. Daniel Hargrove. A name that sent a chill down her spine. 7 years ago, Daniel Hargrove had supposedly died in a car crash on the outskirts of town. Emma remembered the brief obituary, the small funeral. But now, according to the posts, he was back. Curiosity gnawed at her. As a journalist, she'd covered enough odd stories to know when something didn't add up. The next night, armed with a camera and a growing sense of unease, she prowled the streets near where the sightings had occurred. The air was thick with mist, the streetlights casting long, distorted shadows. Then she saw him, a figure standing at the end of an alley, motionless. His face was pale, his clothes damp and frayed, as if he'd crawled out of a grave. Emma's breath hitched. She raised her camera, snapping a quick photo. The flash illuminated his sunken eyes, and for a heartbeat, they locked onto hers. Then he was gone, vanishing into the mist like smoke. The next morning she showed the photo around town. The diner owner, the librarian, even the elderly woman who'd lived there for decades, all claimed they'd never seen the man before. Worse, when she mentioned Daniel Hargrove, their faces went blank. "Oh?" they asked, as if the name meant nothing. Emma's hands trembled as she stared at the photo on her screen. The man was real. But why couldn't anyone remember him? And why did he look at her like he knew her? The cemetery was cloaked in an eerie stillness as Emma Carter stepped through the rusted iron gates, the chill of the evening air settling into her bones. The town's whispers had led her here, to the final resting place of a man who shouldn't exist. The gravel crunched beneath her boots as she navigated the rows of weathered headstones, her flashlight casting long, wavering shadows. Then she saw it, a cracked and moss-covered slab tilted at an unnatural angle, as if the earth itself had rejected it. She knelt, brushing away dirt and decay, her fingers tracing the faint, fragmented letters of a name. James Holloway. The name meant nothing to her, yet it sent a tremor down her spine. The caretaker, a grizzled old man with milky eyes, shuffled over, his lantern swinging gently. "That one's always been empty," he muttered, his voice like dry leaves. "Nobody buried there, never was." Emma frowned, her journalist's instinct flaring. "But the tombstone," the caretaker cut her off with a shake of his head. "Folks say it's bad luck to speak of it. You'd best leave it alone." As she pressed further, his demeanor shifted. A flicker of fear in his gaze, a tightening of his grip on the lantern. The townspeople's unease was palpable. She saw it in the way they averted their eyes when she mentioned James Holloway, in the way conversations died when she walked into the diner. That night, Emma pored over old records in the town hall, her fingers stained with dust. The archives were incomplete, whole sections missing or blacked out. A single, yellowed clipping from 7 years ago mentioned an unfortunate incident involving Holloway, but the details were redacted, leaving only a hollow silence where the truth should have been. The deeper she dug, the more the town seemed to close ranks around its secrets. And then, as she walked home, she heard it. The whisper of her name on the wind, a voice that wasn't there. James Holloway. The air grew colder, and for the first time, Emma wondered if she was chasing a ghost, or if the ghost was chasing her. Emma Carter sat alone in her dimly lit living room, the silence of the night pressing in around her. The investigation into the mysterious sightings of the man, supposedly dead for 7 years, had left her exhausted but no closer to answers. Then, just as she was about to retire for the night, she heard it, a whisper. Soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A voice, raspy and hollow, called a name, Daniel. The name of the man who shouldn't exist. Her breath caught in her throat. The whisper came again, this time from the hallway. Emma stood slowly, her heart pounding, and followed the sound. But the hallway was empty. The whispers seemed to drift through the walls, echoing as if carried by an unseen wind. She checked every room, every corner, but found nothing. Then, as suddenly as they began, the voices stopped. The next morning, Emma combed through the town's archives, digging for any record of Daniel's death. Beneath layers of dust, she found a yellowed newspaper clipping from 7 years ago. The headline read, "D local man found dead under mysterious circumstances." But the article was gutted, whole paragraphs blacked out, leaving only fragments. "Authorities are investigating. No foul play suspected. A funeral to be held." The rest was illegible. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time. They didn't just say Daniel's name. They spoke in fragments, disjointed phrases. They took him, not dead. Promised to return. Emma's hands trembled as she scribbled the words down, her skin prickling with dread. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching her, waiting. Then, in the dead of night, she saw movement in the mirror, a shadow flickering behind her reflection. She spun around, but the room was empty. The whispers crescendoed into a chorus, chanting Daniel's name over and over until she clapped her hands over her ears, desperate to block them out. When silence finally fell, Emma knew one thing for certain: whatever had happened to Daniel, it wasn't over. And somehow, she was now part of it. Emma had spent weeks chasing shadows, poring over fragmented records and vague testimonies about the man who shouldn't exist. The night he appeared on her doorstep, the air turned thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic. His figure was gaunt, his clothes tattered and stained, as if he'd clawed his way out of the ground. His skin was unnaturally pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, deep, hollow pits, seemed to swallow the dim porch light. He spoke in a voice like gravel, each word deliberate. "I never died," he said. "They took me." Emma's breath hitched. The rational part of her screamed to slam the door, but the journalist in her leaned in. Who were they? And why couldn't anyone else remember him? His presence stirred something primal in her, a gnawing dread that this wasn't just a story. It was a warning. He mentioned a place, a room beneath the church, where time didn't move right. Where whispers filled the dark, and things slithered just out of sight. Emma's fingers tightened around the doorframe. Was he a victim, trapped in some unspeakable ordeal? Or was this a trap, his hollow eyes masking something far worse? The townspeople's unease, the redacted files, it all pointed to something buried deep, something that didn't want to stay dead. As he stepped closer, the temperature dropped. Emma's pulse roared in her ears. "They're coming back," he murmured, "and they're hungry." Then, just as suddenly as he appeared, he was gone, leaving only the echo of his words and the chilling certainty that whatever had taken him 7 years ago was now turning its gaze on her. Emma's fingers trembled as she turned the brittle pages of the old town ledger she'd found hidden in the basement of the local library. The ink had faded, but the words were unmistakable, the black hollow pact. Beneath it, a list of names, each one crossed out except for the last. Daniel Harker, the man who had returned from the grave. Her breath caught as she pieced together the fragments of the town's hidden history. Black Hollow hadn't always been a quiet, forgettable place. A century ago, it had been the heart of a cult that worshipped something they called Esh the Watcher in the dark. The ledger detailed rituals performed under the new moon, sacrifices meant to prolong the lives of the cult's inner circle. But one ritual had gone wrong. Daniel Harker had been chosen as the vessel, the one who would carry the Watcher into the world. But instead of dying, he had vanished, until now. Emma's blood ran cold as she read the final entry: "When the 7th year turns, the vessel shall return, and the gate shall open." Her investigation led her to the ruins of an old church on the outskirts of town, its walls etched with the same symbols she'd seen in the ledger. The air was thick with the scent of decay, and the ground was littered with bones. Among them, a rusted locket containing a photograph of a younger Daniel, his eyes filled with dread. Emma's stomach twisted. He hadn't come back by accident. He'd been sent back. That night, the whispers in her house grew louder, forming words she could finally understand. The gate must open. She stumbled back as shadows pooled in the corners of her room, twisting into shapes that almost looked human. The town's unease had turned to panic. People were disappearing, their homes left eerily undisturbed. Emma knew the truth now. Daniel's return wasn't just a mystery. It was the beginning of an ancient horror, and she was standing in its path. The air in Hollowbrook grew thicker with each passing night, as if the town itself was suffocating under an unseen weight. Emma Carter could feel it, the tension, the dread, coiling around her like a serpent. The sightings of the man who shouldn't exist had multiplied, and now, people were disappearing. Shopkeepers, neighbors, even the town's elderly librarian, vanished without a trace. The police were useless, dismissing the disappearances as coincidence, but Emma knew better. She had seen the hollow-eyed man watching her from the shadows, his presence a silent promise of something terrible to come. One evening, as she pored over the redacted newspaper clippings in her dimly lit study, a knock echoed through her house. Not at the door, but at the window. There he stood, his gaunt face pressed against the glass, his fingertips leaving smudges like old blood. He didn't speak, only turned and walked away, leaving Emma with a choice to follow or ignore the chill creeping down her spine. She followed. The abandoned church on the outskirts of town loomed ahead, its broken steeple piercing the moonlit sky. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of damp earth and something metallic, blood. Shadows moved unnaturally along the walls, whispering in voices that weren't human. The man led her to the altar, where a circle of robed figures stood chanting in a language that made her ears ache. Their hoods hid their faces, but she recognized the mayor's voice among them. Emma's breath caught as the man turned to her, his hollow eyes gleaming with something like sorrow. "You're the last," he murmured, and the cultists' chanting grew louder. She realized then. The disappearances, the redacted records, the empty grave. They weren't just bringing him back. They were preparing for something worse, and she was the final sacrifice. Emma's breath came in ragged gasps as she stumbled through the crumbling halls of the abandoned church. The air was thick with the scent of rotting wood and something darker, something metallic and ancient. The whispers she'd heard for weeks had grown into a chorus, chanting in a language she couldn't understand. Shadows twisted along the walls, stretching toward her like grasping hands. At the center of the church stood the man, his hollow eyes locked onto hers. Around him, hooded figures swayed in unison, their faces hidden but their voices rising in a fevered hymn. Emma's pulse pounded in her ears as she clutched the rusted iron cross she'd torn from the wall. It was the only weapon she had left. The man spoke, his voice echoing as if from a great distance. "You were always meant to be here," he said, stepping forward. "The ritual requires a witness, a vessel." Emma's blood ran cold. She understood now. She wasn't just a bystander. She was the final sacrifice. The cultists closed in, their chanting reaching a crescendo. Emma swung the cross wildly, striking one of them. A howl of pain filled the air, and for a moment, the shadows recoiled. She seized the opportunity, bolting for the door. Behind her, the man's laughter followed, a sound that seemed to slither into her bones. She burst outside, the cold night air slapping her face. The town was eerily silent, as if holding its breath. Emma didn't look back. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing in her apartment. But even as she locked the door, she knew it wouldn't matter. The whispers returned before dawn. The man's voice, soft but unmistakable, slithered through the cracks of her home. 7 years, it murmured. "I'll come for you then." Emma stared at her reflection in the mirror, and saw the faint, glowing mark etched into her skin. The ritual had already begun, and she was marked,